I think a democracy requires a common set of facts, a common set of values, and a common reality.
But how much do you think the mainstream media themselves are responsible for those plummeting of levels of trust across society, not just in the media itself?
I think one of the things that's happened is people are like, there's a crisis of trust, there's a crisis of trust, and that's how it's talked about. It's like, no, there's a crisis of trustworthiness. You should not trust something that's not worthy of your trust.
You write, there are many forces in our world insisting again that all Jews must die, but there's a force far, far greater than that, and that's a force of who we are. And you conclude, do we believe in our own story? Can we make it real once again? I believe we can, and that we must. Hearing those words again, all these years later, in this different post-October the 7th context, how do they strike you? Do you still feel that way? And how's the world changed in those intervening years?
Let me just think for a second. It's really emotional to hear you read that, weirdly. I haven't looked back at that book since I wrote it.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on The Brink with me, Jake Wallace-Simons.
And me, Andrew Fox. Today, we are joined by the American journalist, author, and media entrepreneur, Bari Weiss, to discuss the state of America, the state of the West, and the state of, well, everything, really.
Now, parts of our conversations with Bari appear in my new book, Never Again, How the West Betrayed the Jews and Itself. And if you stick with us on The Brink, in future episodes, you'll hear similar discussions with the likes of Douglas Murray, Tom Holland, the historian, not the Spider-Man, Sir Neil Ferguson, Bernard Henri Levy, Ed Hussein, and Ayaan Hirsi Ali, to name a few.
For now, after we've spoken to Bari, stick around to hear us digesting the conversation.
Now, without further ado, we're delighted to present Bari Weiss on The Brink. Bari Weiss, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I just wanted to start off by asking you about your personal journey. It's been quite the trip from 2020, when you had that high-profile bust-up with the New York Times, to today, when I think you can make a claim to be the most or one of the most successful media entrepreneurs in America. What's the journey been like, and what have you learned from it?
Oh, I wouldn't go that far, but thanks for saying so. Look, I mean, for people who have no idea who I am and just happen to be tuning into this conversation, I left the New York Times in the very hot summer of 2020, a moment that I think will be remembered as one of the high watermark periods of intense sort of unraveling and polarization, and a time when the gap between what people could see with their own eyes and the narrative that was being put out there by the legacy press was particularly wide. And I left the New York Times basically so I could do journalism again. And I went into journalism because I couldn't believe that you could get paid to pursue your curiosity about any number of topics in the world and get to write about it, get to talk about it, get to do it freely. And at least at that moment, what was happening at the New York Times was that curiosity had become a liability, and curiosity about a certain number of topics, and it was an increasing number of topics, became, something that was, as I said, was a liability. And so I sort of faced a choice that many people in many institutions in America and across the English-speaking world, across the West, experienced around that time, which was stay and cling to the status and prestige that job offered, or at least offered at the time, or sort of strike out on my own and pursue the very things that I went into this vocation to pursue. And so,
what did it take to make that decision at the time? What was it taken in terms of your character? And it must have been a horribly difficult and courageous decision to make.
Look, I think it's a kind of a sign of our times that a sign of courage is the choice to give up your job at a newspaper. Like, I think it actually says something profound about how lucky we are in many ways to live in this moment, that is what courage required. Like, if you think about what was required of our ancestors and what was called courageous for our great-grandparents' generation, like, we're pretty lucky. What it took was just looking in the mirror. I mean, I don't want to sound cheesy about it, but it was looking in the mirror and asking myself, what's my purpose? What's the purpose of my life? Is the purpose of my life the bragging rights of getting to say that I work at this or that place? Or do I have a greater purpose? Do I stand for a different set of values maybe than the ones that are chic at this moment? Is the purpose of my life getting invited to the right places and sitting at the right tables, or do I have a higher purpose than that? And I mean, I'm not going to lie, it is hard to give up prestige. It is, if you're a normal non-sociopathic person. I think people imagine that like I'm sort of this confrontational person that gets off on fighting with people, and I'm really, I mean, as my wife will tell you, I'm really, really not. I like being liked. I'm normal in that way. I think most people are that way. But
and when you left the New York Times, did you have any sense that there'd be as big an audience for what you were feeling as there ended up being with the Free Press?
I could never have imagined I mean, when I started, it was a little blog called Common Sense that my wife Nellie, set up for me in a moment of frustration where she was sick of me complaining about the state of the world and all of, I made all of these decks that essentially, I remember this one deck that my incredible friend Alana Newhouse, who runs Tablet, made with me, and the deck basically showed a city landscape with the names of many of the institutions that I had grown up to trust. And the landscape was like almost like in a Marvel comic, like, smoke coming out, fires coming out, things were crumbling from within. And then the like solution to it was essentially build an entire new world. And Nellie took a look at that and she was like, that's great. But maybe let's start with something like, you can't win the war without at least winning a battle. And so we started this little blog that was then called Common Sense. And what shocked me was there was not a paywall. People were subscribing to it because they appreciated what I was doing and they saw it as sort of a mission in the world. And that mission was really simple. It was picking up the flag that they clearly, as I saw, they were seeing it from the outside, that so many other journalistic institutions had put down. And so little by little, story by story, sort of talent by talent, person by person, I tried to do something very simple and very old-fashioned, but given our moment, felt radical. And that was to build a news organization, an institution, in a moment where institutions are very unpopular, worthy of the audience's trust. And what I think one of the great, learnings for me, I hate that word. I don't know why I just said that. I think one of the things that I've learned over the past few years, and I think a lot of other people have learned it, is that these institutions that you sort of imagine to be, impenetrable are just people. They're just made up of people. And the choice to every single day you have a choice. Do you put short-termism and sort of the bottom line first, or do you put long-term integrity and trust first? And we did that, I think, from the beginning. And here we are about 5 years later. I'm sitting here in the studio we have, but if you were in our newsroom, you would see every single seat is taken up. Some people are having, yesterday I saw an intern sitting on the floor of our little kitchenette because there weren't enough seats. And, we're bursting at the seams. So the question of whether or not I thought the audience was there, here's what I knew. I knew that I wasn't being served by what was out there. I knew that the feeling that, I don't even know how to describe myself politically anymore, but normal would be one way to put it. A sort of belief that, let's say, Churchill is a hero and not a villain, a belief that the West is good, that America is fundamentally good, that we are the most tolerant and progressive country in the history of the world, despite our unbelievable flaws and very, very troubled past, that is true. The idea that we are all equal because we're all created in the image of God, that there should not be any kind of hierarchy based on our immutable characteristics. Like, I never thought those things needed to be articulated. And we basically entered into a moment where all of those things were up for grabs, and simply articulating them and putting down a flag for them drew a lot of people to it. And so I set out to make something that I felt represented that worldview that, again, growing up, I didn't even think of as a worldview because it felt like the water that we were all swimming in. And yeah, I mean, today we have we have 1.5 million subscribers. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is just how eclectic that mix of people is, how politically mixed, but how we share a set of values, I think, that are bigger than partisan politics. And I articulated what some of those values are, but I think people feel that. I'll say one last thing. I'm speaking to you on a morning where last night I interviewed the Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and the room itself was a microcosm of the world of the free press. And there were downtown sculptors, and there were many federal judges, and there were constitutional scholars, but there were also many people under the age of 30, and it was an encapsulation, I think, of the really incredible community that we've created here that I'm just unbelievably proud of. But if you asked me the day that I started Common Sense if I could have imagined where we've wound up, no, of course not.
And in one of the things that really jumped out from what you were saying was the idea of trust with the free press. And Andrew, being the disinformation expert of the two of us, wants to speak to you about trust and the sort of work that you've been doing in that regard.
Yeah, and I think it's a useful segue because I think the atmosphere you were speaking about from 2020, where people's ideas were being boxed in, has almost kind of mutated, I think, into particularly post 7th of October, this extreme polarization, particularly when it comes to talking about the Gaza war in Israel, and that then spills over to the anti-Semitism debate in the West. The free press has been very impressive on exposing some of the disinformation that's flying around. So looking at those starvation pictures, which turned out to be children with congenital diseases. There's been other work out there where people have discovered that the murdered boy was alive from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. How responsible?
Or I think the most recent one is the Institute of Genocide Scholars. You guys will remember what's the proper name of that organization?
Yeah, the IAGS. Yeah,
where it turned out that in order to join, you just needed to pay like $125, even something like $30, and declare yourself to be a scholar. I think it turned out that the majority of members in that organization were located in Iraq, which is not exactly a bastion of scholarship of genocide.
It boomed from 150 to 400 members straight after 7th of October. So yeah, clearly, things like this rock our faith in institutions and our faith in the media, I think. But how much do you think the mainstream media themselves are responsible for those plummeting of levels of trust across society, not just in the media itself?
I think a democracy requires a common set of facts, a common set of values, and a common reality. And I think one of the sort of tragedies of the past, certainly since COVID, but I think you could go even deeper beyond that, is that, when we were growing up, we're, I think, all around the same age, when you would hear experts say this, you basically thought, I can trust that. And then came a moment, of course, where the experts were saying all kinds of things. Let's just say during the COVID lockdowns, there was a very storied group of doctors here in America that basically said, you can't gather together in your churches or your synagogues or your mosques, but there's an exception if you're marching against racism because racism is a public health catastrophe. So which is it? Right? And how can we trust public health experts that clearly became politicized in that certain way? And you can kind of go down the line. And so now we are living in the aftermath of that. And everyone has their moments, right, of when they sort of lost trust or felt like the expert class, the elite class, the sense-making class, or these institutions broke their trust. And for many people since October 7th, it's been on the issue of Israel, and you've pointed out, Andrew, several of those examples. But for other people that pay attention to any number of other issues, it's those things. And so I think the question that those of us who believe that a democracy requires institutional trust and institutions deserving of your trust, right? Like, I think one of the things that's happened is people are like, there's a crisis of trust, there's a crisis of trust, and that's how it's talked about. It's like, no, there's a crisis of trustworthiness. You should not trust something that's not worthy of your trust. How can we build things that are worthy of trust again? And, if I sort of, what is sort of like the theme of the work we're trying to do at the Free Press, and maybe the work even beyond the Free Press that I'm trying to do in the world, it's trying to see if sort of after that shattering, it's possible to rebuild institutions worthy of our trust once again. And so one of the ways that we do that here at the Free Press is just trying in our way and on the subjects where, we're particularly strong and we're trying to grow the breadth of the kinds of things that we write about, trying to expose examples of when people are getting spun by the legacy press.
That infuriates me about it is that these are professional journalists who know how to do their job. It's not like they don't know how to check sources and check stories, but somehow when it gets to controversial subjects like Israel and Gaza, where people feel so polarized, they become cheerleaders rather than reporters, and they forget almost all of their standards and training and suspend it in the pursuit of giving people what they want to hear.
Right. And I think part of that, I think if you're a real, I don't want to say cynic, but if you're sort of on the outside of the media business, you can sort of imagine almost like this cabal of ideologues that are gathering together to make a choice about bias leaning in a certain direction. That's not how it works at all. It's just that if you have a newsroom and it's made up of X hundred or X thousand people, and they all went to the same 5 schools and the same 5 colleges, and they all vote in the same direction.
It's a groupthink. It's a groupthink. And I know a number of international correspondents who report on the Israel war, and that they genuinely believe certain aspects of the criticism of Israel, which I know to be untrue because I'm not a journalist. I'm not in that space. I'm a professional researcher, and I've seen things with my own eyes. But you can see the groupthink, because they all go drinking together. They all work in the same social circles and they all work in the same space. So there's that continual just reinforcement of the same false idea.
And one of the things that is going on at the Free Press is that our newsroom is a reflection of our audience, and more than that is a reflection of the country. It is very politically mixed. We took a straw poll before the latest election, and a third of people were voting for Trump, a third of people were voting for Kamala, and a third of people weren't voting or were writing in, Steph Curry or whoever else. And in that, we are extraordinarily unique. You just will not find another newsroom like that in America right now. And the question is, that's possible right now with the 60 or so people that work here. Can you do that at scale? And that's a question that I'm asking myself.
Was that some kind of positive action measure that you took, or was it just the vibe?
Part of it is self-selection, right? So like from the beginning, part of the value statement, the mission statement of the Free Press was this idea that, we believe in healthy disagreement. We believe that you can disagree with people and still not just tolerate them, but like them. And that, that getting to the truth requires being in conversation with people, with the smartest, most good faith people on the other side of an argument. And from the beginning, we tried to model that kind of debate on our podcasts, but also in our pages. And there are certain people that are drawn to that kind of thing. So part of it is self-selection. And then part of it is, actively trying to go out and find people who are surprising, who are provocative, who surprise me and challenge me and delight me. Because if that's the case here, that's certainly going to be the case in what the audience is encountering when they're reading us or listening to us or watching us.
Right.
So would you say what we call legacy media is irredeemable in that sense?
No, I don't think it's irredeemable. I mean, I'm an optimist, though, guys. I mean, I'm Jewish, which in the 21st century requires being an optimist. I think because how unlikely it is that we're even here. So I'm fundamentally an optimist. Having gone through now the experience of building something, I know how difficult it is. So my advice always to people when, and I talk to so many people in so many different institutions or schools or whatever it is, museum boards, whatever, who are facing the kind of institutional capture that we sort of began this conversation talking about. And my response is always, if it's reformable, reform it, because it is so much easier, I think, to try and fix something that's broken than to build something totally new. So, far be it for me to know always, and when I'm in conversation with people, I think, can have their best sense of whether the thing they want to fix is fixable or if they have to start anew. My feeling at that moment in 2020 was start anew. But that isn't to say that there aren't incredible challenges in the world of independent media. The problem of audience capture isn't just a problem for the New York Times. It's a problem for anyone in that creates anything who relies on people to pay them for the thing that they create. And so the challenge that exists at scale at the New York Times exists just as much for any independent podcaster. That's just that's the way this market is structured, and that's the challenge for all of us to resist.
I just want to take a sidestep, if I can, to talk about anti-Semitism in America and across the world. So I've got a copy of your book here, a well-thumbed copy of your book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, from back in 2019, which of course was sparked by the horrific Tree of Life shooting, which was the deadliest attack on Jews in American history, 11 people killed. And at the end of that book, you write, "There are many forces in our world insisting again that all Jews must die, but there's a force far, far greater than that, and that's a force of who we are." And you conclude, "Do we believe in our own story? Can we make it real once again? I believe we can, and that we must." Hearing those words again, all these years later, in this different post-October the 7th context, how do they strike you? Do you still feel that way? And how's the world changed in those intervening years?
Let me just think for a second. It's really emotional to hear you read that, weirdly. I haven't looked back at that book since I wrote it.
Take your time.
No, I'm just like, it's changed so much. It's just unbelievable how much has changed. And also how little has changed, which is maybe the answer. I feel I remember the person that wrote those words, and I remember the emotions I was feeling in that moment. And it's not even possible to express how deeply I feel about that sentiment. Both remembering from my perspective the values of America and what America is at its best, and the values and the story of the Jewish people and what that means to me. I wrote that book in sort of like a very, very fast flurry in the aftermath of the Tree of Life massacre. And I think many people at the time felt like this will be the moment of awakening, right? Like this will be the moment where people understand how dangerous this hatred is of Jews, but it's about so much more than Jews. It's about a culture of scapegoating and a culture where the center has collapsed, and the Jews are the hatred of Jews is a symptom of that thing. And this will be the moment where sort of everyone wakes up in the aftermath of it. And of course, that isn't what happened at all. And looking back now, it was sort of a harbinger of what was to come. And I think one of the things that I've thought about a lot over the past 6 years, I cannot believe it's been about 6 years since that happened, is, the response and the outpouring that happened in the aftermath of Pittsburgh was just very, sounds like a strange word, but comforting, right? There was such a moral outrage from pretty much every corner of American life. There was just horror and an absolute consensus that what happened to 11 of my neighbors was evil, and there was no debating that, and there was no debating the evil of the person that walked into the synagogue that day and mowed them down. And what's changed, of course, is we've now lived through massacres of other Jews. Of course, I'm thinking now about October 7th, but I could also be thinking about the two Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lashinsky, who were murdered outside of the museum in Washington, D.C., or I'm thinking about the Holocaust survivors in Colorado that were assaulted with a Molotov cocktail, one of whom died. And you think about the response in the aftermath of those things and how profoundly, profoundly different they are, ranging from indifference or silence to even justification of the violence. And I would be lying to you if I said that I could have imagined that that would be the reality in September of 2025. But here we are.
Well, as a non-Jew, I think there's a paradox here that, frankly, before 7th of October, I was aware of anti-Semitism. I was aware of the odd, off-color joke in my office's mess about the Jewish tailor that we all used to use. But it wasn't.
Later, you're going to have to tell me the joke.
Oh no, it's just it was just an anti-Semitic trope about trying to get money out of you. It was that
Right.
It was that straightforward. But it wasn't really anything you paid huge attention to or heard that you heard at great scale. Whereas since 7th of October, it seems to me that not only has anti-Semitism exploded, but also the acceptance of it is now commonplace. Whereas in the mess, when someone made that off-color joke, you'd sort of give a sideways look and just go, and then carry on. Now people will openly, and because I commentate on Israel, I've been called every anti-Semitic name under the sun. But the fact that people will just use those slurs openly, and more importantly, everyone else doesn't pile on them. It's a socially acceptable thing to do now. So in tandem with the explosion of anti-Semitism, you have an explosion of acceptance of anti-Semitism, which, as an outsider from the non-Jewish community looking in, I find genuinely chilling.
Ruth Weiss, who's basically pioneered the field of Yiddish studies at Harvard, talks about anti-Semitism not as the sort of country club, restricted, the odd comment about penny pinchers or whatever people talked about with regard to that tailor. That's bad. That's, bigotry. It's horrible against Jews or anyone else. But what anti-Semitism is, and she writes about this, I think, so powerfully, is it's a politics organized against the Jews. And I think that is the thing that we have seen sort of become normalized, a politics that has the scapegoating of Jews and the Jews as the explanation for all of the world's evils at the center of it. And that is coming for sure, and has been for a while, from the far left. And it's also emanating increasingly from the fringes, maybe beyond the fringes at this point, of the right. And so you have a kind of institutionalized anti-Semitism that's coming out of our elite universities and some of these sense-making institutions that's sort of been there for a while. And then you have it coming now from the populist right. And it's sort of squeezing the Jews from both sides.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, we can just maybe look at this as a
natural segue to what we were going to ask you about, which is the extremes that we're seeing. You have the progressive radicals who are driving the Democrat Party sort of off a cliff, as it looks to me as a Brit looking at American politics. But you also have the extremist sort of MAGA, and then even moving beyond that to the woke right. Your Candace Owens kind of bizarre conspiracy theorist ranting that has huge traction, nevertheless. Do you think this is a problem that can be solved easily enough, or and what would you say the answer is?
Certainly not easily.
What do we do about it? I think is the killer question.
I don't think there's any question that, especially for those of us that spend a lot of time on the internet, whether you're looking at Hassan Piker on the left or Candace Owens on the right, that those people have a lot of juice and a lot of traction because it's edge and because it's extreme and because it's polarizing, and therefore the algorithm rewards it. And that is just the reality of that's how things catch fire on social media and on the internet. I also believe very strongly that the vast majority of people, at least here in America, would look at you like you were a crazy person if you suggested in real life half of the things that they say on those shows. Whether it's that Brigitte Macron is secretly a man, or that 9/11 was actually an inside job. And by the way, you could hear either of those things on either of those people's shows, probably. And is it really right or left? Who knows anymore? Because the tips of the horseshoe have met so fully. And so I do believe that the things that happen online do not remain there. That's one of the great lessons. And the things that remain on campus do not remain there. They trickle down to the rest of the country. So I take what's happening there extremely seriously, but I still very much believe that the vast majority of people in America, would look at you like you were a crazy person if you suggested that, Winston Churchill was anything other than the man that saved the free world. It's just a sign, I think, of a growing societal sickness that people are being drawn to that. And they're being drawn to that because they feel that they have been left behind. They've been demoralized. There's many reasons that people are being drawn to that right now. And I think that the big true challenge is not to just combat the misinformation and the lies that are out there, but help people feel and actually, and this is a question more for our politics than our media, like they have a shot at the American dream, like there's hope, like they are not living in a world in which, the system is rigged against them. And that's, if there's a project for the rest of our lives, it's certainly that one.
Yeah. And, I'm in a number of WhatsApp groups where people discuss on, how to strategically approach this problem. And there's many schools of thought. One is that you have to attack back. One is that, mockery or just scorn is the best way of dealing with it. And I remain fairly convinced that there's actually not an online answer, and it sits far deeper in society where you need education and you need, as you say, the economic situation to be in a place where people don't feel completely disenfranchised and left behind. And I would completely agree with you on that.
But I think what we also need, though, is something I talk about in my book quite a lot, is the silent majority to become unsilenced a little bit, and for people to begin to replace what Roger Scruton described as the down with us, the cult of down with us that's been imposed upon, certainly upon ourselves in Britain and in Europe, and to an extent in America from the left, and to exchange that for an up with us mentality where, again, like you said, Barry, right at the beginning, where we actually value our values and the things that we've stood for centuries, and the people who fought for them, and are proud of ourselves. And I think that if we're allowed to be proud of ourselves again from the centre, as it were, not the political centre, but from just where most people are, then the silent majority can begin to find its voice, and the fringes will once again become the fringes. I think that's really the challenge of our generation.
I think one of the ways to do that is just to create, I think a lot of times people think about the center or the place where the silent majority sits as sort of like the midpoint between two extremes. You have to build a charismatic, you have to build a better party. And I don't mean political party. I mean, you have to make that position attractive and generative and exciting, and a place that people want to be a part of, not as the center as an absence of the extremes, but the center broadly as the place to be. And I think that you sort of see that with some really charismatic personalities in the world of tech and, people that are trying to build new things, I find extraordinarily inspiring. And I just think a lot of effort needs, I think part of the challenge is that the center, I think to many people feels like an absence or like a neutral space, and it needs to feel actually like a different charismatic place.
That's right. And I feel like if the centre is able to find that new energy, then anti-Semitism will be reduced greatly as well. Well, Barry, I know you've got to go. We've run out of time, but thank you so much for spending so much time with us. It's been a fascinating discussion, and wish you all the best with all of your various endeavours.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That was so enlightening, and it was great that you've left us on a positive note rather than the depressing conversation that we had before it. So thank you very much indeed.
Great to see both of you.
So Jake, I thought that was more uplifting than I was expecting.
Yeah.
It was really good to see that positivity coming through. And actually, because I think when you're stuck in this quagmire, sometimes it looks like there's no way out.
Yeah.
And, Barry's proposed, I think, a really positive solution to some of the problems that our societies face. What do you think is going to stay with you from that?
I think two things, really. I think, firstly, I was so inspired by what she said about building the free press and how it was important to get back to why people want to go to journalism in the first place, which is that trust. And try to, journalism should be the place that you go, that the public goes to hear stuff that they can trust, to hear the news that they can trust as being true, and opinion that's that's valid, that's not just made up. And I think gradually we've seen the erosion of that with the development of groupthink in the mainstream media, as it's called, particularly places like the BBC, and particularly since October the 7th. And that's done so much to undermine people's trust in the mainstream media. But then as a journalist myself, I worry about where people then go. Some bloke with a microphone on YouTube doesn't know what, present company accepted, who doesn't know anything about anything, but people trust that bloke more than they do journalists. And that's where we've got to. So it was quite inspiring to hear the renewed focus on trust again. And of course, it played into all the disinformation stuff that we've both been talking about for ages. If you've been enjoying the conversation so far, don't panic. To catch the rest of the episode, just head over to our Substack at thebrinkpodcast.co.uk. And don't forget to grab a copy of my brand new book, Never Again: How the West Betrayed the Jews and Itself, in all good bookshops now.